All right, everyone. Glad you guys could make it. We are going to look at the last chapter, the fourth chapter of Colossians today, um, and wrap up this letter. Again, this really significant letter to a unsuspecting and insignificant, kind of inauspicious church that was put on the map because Paul saw a need there again to address some of these heresies that were coming up in this little town. All right. So, having said that, let's start with a prayer and then get to it. Let us pray the Lord. Lord, have mercy. Shine within my heart, loving Master, the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of my mind that I may understand your teachings. Instill in me also a reverence for your blessed commandments, so that having conquered sinful desires, I may pursue a spiritual way of life, thinking and doing all those things that are pleasing to you. For you, Christ my God, are my light, and to you I give glory, together with the Father and the Holy Spirit, now and forever. Amen. All right. Okay. So we were talking last week in chapter 3 about some of the trailblazing, glass breaking, uh, kind of radical teaching that Paul is putting out there about these equality of people that would have been in different social statuses. You know, we're talking about obviously men and women. We're talking Greeks and Jews. We're talking about slaves and masters. And so we're talking about be equal, be harmonious with all. Make sure that you preserve that unity in your church above all else, right? And that will then lead us into the fourth chapter here, because like we said, all of the numbers were put in after the fact. They were putting the chapters and verses were put in during the first translation of the English when King James was commissioning that translation to be done. So there's some that suggest that this first line is the beginning of chapter 4. We talked about it a little bit at the end of chapter 3. Having said that, let's reread that first verse and go through the verse 4 here and talk about all that in one setting. So chapter 4, verse 1. Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Okay. So, like you can see, there's kind of an abrupt transition there if we include that first verse in chapter 4 as opposed to putting it at the end of chapter 3. But again, subjects like we talked about last week naturally have humility. Um, Masters also have to bear a little bit of this humility that their bondservants have, knowing that they also have a master who's in heaven, that they have that in common. And that would have been something that a slave owner would have never considered in their life. And now Paul is saying that you should, okay? That we all are bondservants to God. So moving on now, Paul is urging us to persevere in prayer. There are times when all of us lack spiritual endurance. Well, the remedy is to continue to pray. St. John of Kronstadt, a 19th century, or I guess, yeah, a 19th century, because he lived in the 1800s, a 19th century priest living in Russia, in Kronstadt, this very small kind of industrial, rough town uh, in Russia. He was a married priest and kind of like an unsuspecting, just I don't know, poor married priest. But he liturgized every day, and he would give anyone anything if they ever needed it. But he once said that when you are praying, if your body gets tired while you're praying, continue to pray because your body is lying. That's what he said. He was like, if you are praying and you get tired, continue because your body's lying. That was his perspective. This idea of like, we can persevere through this, that God will strengthen us to do this. Now, again, we're talking about someone who had reached a height of, spiritual devotion and asceticism and he wasn't, again, a monk. He wasn't a monk. He was a married priest living in the world. but certainly a heroic and kind of legendary uh, person of prayer, warrior of prayer. So again, Paul here, like St. John of Kronstadt, is telling us to continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant, right? Our Thanksgiving should never have a day off. We talk about Thanksgiving being a holiday that we're fast approaching. Let's have Thanksgiving every day, you know. Let's be thankful every day. Let's be vigilant in our Thanksgiving. So no spiritual drought uh, can affect a person when they're continuing to pray, right? We can't have we just if we are clinging to prayer, we won't find ourselves in a spiritual drought. We might find ourselves in challenging times, that we might find ourselves in illness, we might find ourselves, unemployed or whatever the thing may be, but we won't find ourselves in a spiritual valley. Um, the word Paul uses for vigilant here in Greek is rigorundes, rigorundes, from agiro, which means to work, literally to stay awake, agiro. Um, and you might recognize this, uh, Grigorundes, from when we are in Holy Week. So Holy Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, those first three services are the bridegroom services, right? And we walk the icon, we process the icon of the bridegroom around the church, because he's entered, Palm Sunday, in Jerusalem. We remember that on Palm Sunday, and so he's triumphant, and we're all there. We're excited when we thought like a conquering king was coming to deliver us, by might, by earthly might, and then when we realized that he wasn't, soon all of that crowd that was adoring him and screaming and like putting down their clothes on the floor so that the donkey could walk on top and waving palm branches, they all left, right? And the only ones who remained were those who were intimately worshiping Christ. And right, the ones that were prepared to be the bridegroom or the bride to his bridegroom, right? And the words of that hymn are, behold, the bridegroom is coming in the middle of the night. Blessed are the servants who are awake and watching. Unworthy are the others who are being lazy, right? And that word, Idού ο νυμφίος έρχεται εν το μέσο νυχτός και μακάριος ειδούλος ότι Grigorundes, right here. That's the word, right? Blessed are the servants who are awake and watching, right? So that's the word here in verse, what is it? 2? Yeah, in verse 2. We chant every evening on those bridegroom services. Blessed is the servant who is awake and watching. So this wakeful imagery brings to mind some scriptural occurrences allowing sleep to conquer our spirituality. Think about when the disciples fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Christ was praying before his arrest and his crucifixion, and think about, they were even sleeping before the transfiguration, and in Luke chapter 9 verse 32, before they awoke to see Christ, shining, and then the wise and foolish virgins in that parable that he gave when he was talking about those who had their oil lamps trimmed and those who didn't, which is also kind of echoing what we just talked about this past Sunday when we were talking about the rich man and Lazarus, right? And that there's this big divide, this gulf that was between Abraham's bosom, heaven, and Hades and hell, right? And that great divide was something that Abraham couldn't bridge because he was subject to the law, and just like all of us, there was no grace there when he lived. Christ can bridge that gap, but still that great divide, that gulf, that impassable, like, sorry, we can't do anything for you. That's your faith and love, right? If you don't have that, no one can save. Christ can't save you if you don't have that, right? That's the thing that we need to offer as like the small little token that we can provide, and then he does everything, all the rest. And that's what he's talking about in that parable of the wise and foolish virgins. When the foolish ones who didn't have the oil go back to the store in the middle of the night after he arrives, go and buy some, then they come back and then they knock on the door after he's gone in with the wise virgins. They say, he says truly through the door, I don't know you, right? So that big divide like happens when we run out of time, right? Our earthly life here, we need to be vigilant in praying. We need to be vigilant in our faith, right? Never lose faith. We have to also be vigilant in our mercy and our love for each other, right? Persevere in prayer, persevere together. Masters, slaves, persevere together, right? Greeks, Jews, figure it out together, right? Because if you don't, when before the time is up, there's that gulf there that we can't figure out. Abraham couldn't resurrect you because it was because of the law, and Moses couldn't resurrect you because it was because of the law, right? Well, Christ now can bridge that so long as you have faith and love. So again, we're talking about this staying awake, staying vigilant, vigorundas, right? Make sure that you persevere in there, that you don't have any days off. Okay. We got to pray all the time, but more importantly, we got to love all the time. We got to be faithful all the time. All right. All right, let's go 5 and 6 here. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. All right. Paul is urging us to season our speech with salt. And he's also saying that we are to walk in wisdom towards those who are outside. So season our speech with salt and walk in wisdom toward those who are outside. We will attract new believers, right, to the faith by how we walk the faith. Not if we can like pin them down in a debate, or like out-reason them. Not if we can make like a catchier YouTube video or a catchier TikTok. We're gonna attract people to the faith by how we walk the faith. Okay. Very rarely we very rarely, catechize through theology. We do that in catechism, but we don't we catechize with theology through theology, but we don't evangelize through theology, right? We're going to evangelize through acts of mercy, acts of compassion, missionary efforts, which are always like practically charged, right? You're talking about medical missions, you're talking about feeding missions, you're talking about education missions, where we're going to go and serve at this school and teach kids how to read and write and how to count and do math, right? All of those missionary efforts are always coupled with something practical where we're serving someone else, right? After that, once we kind of open their eyes to seeing like the beautiful ways in which we are, the ways in which we live, the selflessly kind of compassionate ways that we live. Now we can start talking to them about theology. Now we can start catechizing them and building up their spiritual literacy. All right. So we must live Christly lives so that we can then preach Him through our actions. It is very rare that someone is argued into Christianity, yet many are brought in the same way that Nathaniel was in the beginning, the first chapter of the Gospel of John, right? Come and see. I found something good. I think you'll like it. Why don't you come and see? Walk with me, right? Nathaniel would have never met Christ if Philip didn't literally walk him to Christ, right? So that's the same thing that we have to do. We have to literally walk. So, the best thing that we can do is be good Christians and be that evident in our conduct. All right. Continuing on, verse 7 through 15 here, and we're going to start talking about some of these faithfully and vigilant companions that Paul had. Even though he's in house arrest, we're going to get some like a roll call here of a bunch of people who remained vigilant with Paul during an inconvenient time. And we actually talked about this. This was the epistle. Not too long ago, when we were what liturgy was it? It was the liturgy for St. Luke, right? Because Luke is going to be named in here. Right? Yes. So yeah. So we had just read this during one of the feast days here recently for St. Luke on October 18th. All right, so let's read on. Tychicus, a beloved brother, faithful minister, this is verse 7, and fellow servant in the Lord, will tell you all the news about me. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, that he may know your circumstances and comfort your hearts. With Onesimus, right? He was a slave. a faithful and beloved brother who is one of you. They will make known to you all of the things which are happening here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are my only fellow workers in the kingdom of God who are of the circumcision. That means the Jews, right? These are the only former Jews who are now Christians who are my co-workers. They have proved to be a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a bondservant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has great zeal for you and those who are in Laodicea, right? That's and those in Hierapolis. Those were the two neighboring cities. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, in Nymphas, and the church that is in his house. Okay. So this was the epistle reading on October 18th on the feast day of St. Luke, because obviously he's being named here. So let's go through all of these people and talk a little bit about them and who they were, and why Paul is, kind of name dropping them. All right. So first and foremost, Tychicus, right there in verse 7. Tychicus is the representative of the church of the Roman province of Asia, tasked with carrying the congregation's offering to the poor Christians in Jerusalem. And we know that from Acts chapter 20. He comes up in Acts chapter 20. Never mind. I guess do not disturb notifications. Like, I clicked it. Do I need to do it on my phone too? Gosh. No, it says do not disturb on my phone. I apologize, all of you who are watching this later. I don't know what that was. It says do not disturb. It says do not disturb. I'm going to throw it away and see if it makes any difference. It came up on both. All right, so Tychicus, he was the leader, the Roman, the Roman Christian leader of the entire region of Asia, right? So this is Asia Minor, this is Turkey, and so he was the one that was charged with fundraising efforts in that Asia Minor peninsula so that he could bring needed funds back to the church in Jerusalem. We see that in chapter 20 of the book of Acts, verse 4. Um, so, I mean, really, when we talk about like our own archdiocese and our own patriarchate, we do that. We still do that today. In fact, we did that this past Sunday, right? The Philoptos passed the trays, not the parish council. The Philoptos passed trays. Why? To raise critical money for the patriarchate of Constantinople, right? Where there is incredible persecution that we are not feeling, right? We don't have that same persecution, that same burden here in America. They are living in a land where it is legally inconvenient to be Christian. It's not illegal to be Christian in Turkey, but certainly you have to endure more taxes, more, red tape when you're trying to talk about purchasing land or starting businesses, things like that. Um, we have a theological school in Constantinople called Halki that hasn't been open since the 50s, right? Since the 50s? Yeah, 50s, or 60s, something like that, someplace right around there. Um, and it hasn't been open. They only allow us to make repairs on it. So we can't renovate it, we can't update it. So if you ever walk in there, because you can still go and visit it, you can walk in there and see the desks that they were using during the last day of classes, because we can't replace them, but like we can like fix the roof if the roof breaks. But the like Turkey just doesn't let us do that. The patriarch himself has to be a Turkish citizen, right? And they have input in like who becomes our patriarch, right? Because they reside in present day Istanbul. So it's and we're talking about an area that had 800,000 Christians in it back in 1453, which is an enormous number, right, for 1453. And so when at the time when Constantinople fell, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Christians that are now 2,000 that live in the or less that live there. So it's something that we can appreciate here in the 21st century, unfortunately. So yeah, so right, we see that our Philoptos here was representatives on behalf of the archdiocese, on behalf of our metropolis, on behalf of our parish, right? That are collectively working to help support the greater kind of global capital of the church. So yeah. So that's who this man Tychicus was. All right, Tychicus was their representative that would bring funds back to Jerusalem. Um, St. John Chrysostom writes about this, saying, "Observe how Paul does not put everything into his epistles, but only the things necessary and urgent. In the first place, he doesn't want his epistles to be unnecessarily long. Plus, some things are best not mentioned in writing. Also, secondly, his messenger will be more respected if he too has something personal to relate. In this way, Paul demonstrates his affection for Tychicus, right? When he's talking about, and he's going to tell you other things as well. Listen to him, right? There are too many things here for me to mention. He's obviously he's the one holding this letter, but he's going to have other things to say. Please regard what he's going to say because he's your leader, your representative that like links you to me, then links you to you know Saint Jacobus and Saint Peter and all those that are still in Jerusalem. Okay, so that's Tychicus. Now, Onesimus was the runaway slave from Philemon. So when we read St. Paul's letter to Philemon, and he's talking about this slave that he lost and this slave that found his way to Rome and found his way to Paul and became a Christian, that's Onesimus. All right. So Paul is sending him back to his master, but instead of calling him a slave, he refers to him as a brother here. Right. So there's no coincidence why chapter 3 ended the way it did, knowing that he was running out of, Rome and he was kind of wrapping up his letter and he was about to name drop this person who was going to be traveling with this group back to Asia Minor, and knowing that one of them was a runaway slave, then he was sending him back. So he was like, let me soften the blow of his master. Let's make Philemon read this and my personal letter to him. The letter of Philemon, the book of Philemon. Let's make him read that first before he has to interact with this runaway slave, this AWOL, servant of his. Okay. And so calling him a brother after having said, you're all equal, you're all bondservants to Christ, right? So even you masters have a master in heaven. Receive him as an equal, receive him as a brother, not as your subordinate. Okay, so that's Tychicus, that's Onesimus. Let's talk about Aristarchus. Aristarchus is a Macedonian from Thessaloniki. We see that also in Acts chapter 20, verse 4. So the same place that we see Tychicus, we also see Aristarchus. And he's a good person to have in a tight corner. He was present at the riot in the Temple of Diana in Ephesus, Acts chapter 19, verse 29. He saw Paul off when he set sail as a prisoner to Rome in Acts chapter 27, verse 2. And now he is Paul's fellow prisoner. So whenever things get the grimmest, it seemed like Aristarchus was there. Okay. Some suggest that he even enrolled himself as a legal slave to Paul so that he could accompany him into prison, which is what we saw with Luke as well. The same is true. The same is true because you could bring two slaves with you if you were a Roman citizen being detained and being imprisoned. So there's some that suggest, some biblical scholars that suggest that Luke and Aristarchus were those two slaves, the two men, these two Christian men, these two disciples of Paul that loved Paul so much and didn't want to leave him, so they sold themselves into slavery to Paul so they could go with him to prison. They wouldn't be martyred with him, they wouldn't be executed with him, but they'd still be serving Paul and listening to him and helping him write things and helping him like receive visitors and all that. Um, you know, basically serving as like his archdeacons, right? The archdeacon, who I'm classmates with, Father Dionysius, right? Um, is his only role is to travel with the archbishop. That's his only role, right? He is, and we saw this with Father Panteleimon, right? The archdeacon for Archbishop Demetrius for what was he? 13 years. He was his archdeacon, right? Uh, Father Panteleimon became a priest after what, 6 years ago or whatever, after he was no longer the archdeacon when His Eminence Archbishop of Photos came. And so he became a priest. He's now in Brookville at Holy Resurrection. Amazing parish. They're doing awesome stuff. If he and I were to celebrate a liturgy together, I would be in front of him because I've been a priest longer. He's been a clergy member for twice as long as me, right? But most of that time was spent as a deacon. So he like delayed his professional career, right? In like worldly terms, right? He delayed promotions, right? Because of his love for the archbishop. And he couldn't imagine not serving him. And he's married with kids. Like he's not like a celibate who's like, oh, I don't have anything else, right? Um, that's something that's really amazing, right? Where you drop at the drop of a hat and you're always traveling if you're the archdeacon, because the archbishop's always traveling. So you're never home, on any weekend, right? So like the simple joy that I have of like coaching my son's flag football games, every Saturday and, watching Hope, at soccer practice last night. I didn't because I was flying back from New York, but I would have been there if my flight wasn't delayed 4 hours or whatever it was yesterday. But so like those simple joys, the archdeacon doesn't get to have, but they have these incomparable joys of being close to the leader of the church, like these holy men, right? And so Aristarchus and Luke really in a very pretty apt comparison were like the archdeacons for Paul, the great apostle, and like willingly chose that life. So it's not too dissimilar. Now, and Father Dionysius is doing an unbelievable job, just like Father Pantaleimon did for many years. He's as long as the archbishop is the archbishop, he's going to have Father Dionysius by his side. He just loves him. He loves him. They like there's such an affection with His Eminence and Father, that it's beautiful. It's like really beautiful to see. And it's a match made in heaven. And so that's what we're seeing here with Paul and Aristarchus, Paul and Luke. Luke had a little bit more of a little bit more of a extra ministry because he was most likely Paul's physician. So he felt like he had a duty, to serve Paul in this way. Whereas Aristarchus is like, no, I want to be your companion. I want to learn and help you in ministry. Luke is probably doing that too, but also probably saying, hey, I love you and I've cared for you for so long with whatever this thorn in your side is, right? We were talking about that yesterday, or excuse me, last week, as we were walking out. What was this thorn in his side? Um,
Was it a real thorn or
it was certainly it was not a real thorn. It might have been a physical infirmity. It might have been like a physical condition that really hampered him. It might have been, some temptation. It might have been like a metaphorical take for like persecution by someone else, or Herod or whoever, right? So who knows? But many suggest that it was something physical. A lot of people talk about, malaria that was going around in the regions, especially in the coastal regions that he was at, like what Ephesus would have been, and that would have, affected his vision. It would have given him splitting headaches, things like that. And so Paul would have needed someone like a physician like St. Luke. And so St. Luke was the physician who remained with Paul to the end. He recorded Paul's words in his gospel, right? So the Gospel of Luke are Paul's words. Luke's too, obviously, Luke's too. And you can see some of those things, like when Luke is talking a lot about the Virgin Mary, because he has that, but Mark and John and Matthew kind of like leave that part out. Luke is the one that includes a lot of the things that we have about the Virgin Mary and, Joachim and Anna and all those things. Like he's the one that includes that stuff, the presentation of Christ into the temple, he records that. So you can see that Luke had, his own things to contribute because he was close to Panagia, the Theotokos. We have no suggestion that Paul was ever close to the Virgin Mary. So certainly you can see both of their voices contributing, but the brunt of Luke's letter, the brunt of Luke's gospel is, Paul's kind of dictation.
So when Paul was in prison and he was chained up to guards 24/7,
Mhm.
were there two slaves in there for him as
Yeah,
well?
that those were yeah,
And they would just
Aristarchus and Luke.
take.
Right. And so they're probably getting him dressed and all that because he can't, do things like that. They're doing all that. Yeah. So Aristarchus and Luke are the ones that are in there helping Paul while he's arrested. Pretty amazing.
Because these days, nobody gets to take
Yeah, no, no, of course
servants to
not. Of course.
prison.
Well, again, because we don't have slavery, which is good,
It's gonna
which is a
say
good thing.
you're slave to your
Yeah, right.
cell,
Yeah.
bed, or
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
24/7.
Exactly. So yeah. So thank God we don't. But like what a beautiful thing that they were able to offer Paul in those last years. Pretty amazing. And for them, I'm sure that they felt like it was a privilege to do that. Okay, so that was Aristarchus and Luke. Okay, so let's talk about Mark. We talked about this briefly a couple weeks back. Mark was so close to Peter, not Paul, Peter, that he called him his son. Peter calls Mark his son, like he just views him as a spiritual son, right? Much of that he wrote in his gospel, right? We're direct.
The same Mark.
This is Mark,
Gospel.
the gospel Mark, right? The gospel author Mark writes quite a bit. And so we just talked about how Luke's gospel largely is from Paul.
Mhm. Mark.
Peter is largely speaking to Mark, right? Okay, so Mark and is you can hear in this gospel we talked in this letter you Paul says like read also my letter to the Laodiceans. We don't have there's no book of the Laodicean. We don't have that. He was most likely either meaning Ephesians, because Ephesians would have been, the letter to this region, or he could have meant the Gospel of Luke that was in Laodicea because Luke was, visiting that area. Yeah. Laodicea will be with Hierapolis a little bit east of Ephesus. So yeah, so Mark, okay, so Mark is largely the traveling companion of Peter, where we were talking about Luke and Aristarchus being the traveling companions of Paul. So Mark was very close to Peter. Peter viewed him as a son, and Mark wrote much of Peter's accounts and Peter's firsthand kind of witness of what happened with Christ. Yet, when he traveled with Paul and Barnabas as their secretary earlier than that, right? So originally, Paul was in charge of Mark, and Mark was working with him. So Mark was traveling with Paul and Barnabas as their secretary. He's surnamed John in Acts chapter 13, verse 5. They talk about John, right? Um, the cousin of Barnabas. He fled when things got difficult in Acts chapter 13, verse 13, right? Chapter 13, verse 13. Mark leaves. And this might have been when malaria was happening, right? It got a little bit too tough. In a long time, it was a long time before Paul could forgive him for that, being abandoned by this companion here. Yet, after Mark's missionary trip to Alexandria, where he founded the church in Alexandria, that's why if you ever go to Egypt, every church is named St. Mark. Every if you ever go to Egypt, like half of the churches are St. Mark for sure. In fact, when you have like Coptic churches here in America, many of them are the Church of St. Mark, because he was the founder of the church of Egypt, the Church of Africa, really. Um, so Mark went on his missionary trip to Alexandria, and he found himself back in Paul's good graces as he assisted him during his final imprisonment. We see that here, obviously, because this is a prison epistle, but also in Philemon chapter 24. Philemon verse 24, because it's only one chapter. Philemon verse 24, as well as 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. Right. So Mark was with Paul for his first missionary journey. and then someplace it gets too dicey, he abandons him. Paul swears off Mark, and you actually see that in the chapter 13 of Acts, where he's like, "No, Barnabas, you can take Mark. I'm not taking him again." Right? I'm gonna take Silas now, right? And so that's what happens. But someplace along there, Mark grows up, right? Mark gets his courage, finds his second, lease on life, right, with Peter. And at some point, when he comes of his own, he's no longer with Peter anymore and goes off to plant a church in Alexandria. And then after that, when Paul needs him again, he goes maybe to make good, to like make amends before it's too late. Maybe he felt so compelled, uh, and said, "You know what? I was a dumb kid. I was a silly kid, and I lost my nerve, and now this man that I should have never left, but was somehow I still had like a fruitful ministry. Let me go and make amends here before it's too late." And he does, and now he gets this beautiful, this beautiful like word of support, where we have plenty of records of Paul being not so gracious with his view on Mark. And so, like, what a turnaround! It's beautiful, right? So, Mark, he's not, but for me, he's like the patron saint of second chances. Like, and how beautiful that he got that mercy from someone who also knows a little bit about second chances himself with Paul, right? Paul got a really great second chance, when it would have been very easy for Christ to view Paul in the same way that, like when we had Ananias, right? Um, who comes and like is cheating a little bit on her, on like their giving back to him and his wife, when they're cheating a little bit on their giving to the church, and Peter notices it, and then they drop dead, right? In the book of Acts. We talked about that last year, right? We're like, gosh, what a stern kind of way to deal with someone, right? God could have dealt with Paul, and Peter could have dealt with Mark that way, but they didn't. God God could have dealt with Paul that way, and they didn't. So I love that. I love that we see a little bit of a we're talking about this gulf, this like harmony that we need to make sure that we promote and eradicate this like divide between the church, these fractions, these kind of like fissures in the church body. And now you're seeing it here, Paul actually doing it. And what do we talk about? The best advertisement for Christianity is how we walk it. Well, Paul's doing it right now. He's telling the people that you need to be live in harmony with each other, bridge these divides, and like remove them from your like how you view each other. Like I don't want you to see a Jew. I don't want you to see a Greek. I don't want you to see a slave or master. I want you to see brothers and sisters, right? And so now he's doing it himself, being like, all right, this guy Mark really crossed me, but he's my brother and I love him. And right, of him you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him, right? So he's talking like, I've spoken to you about this guy before. Now, if he comes to you, welcome him. What a thing. What a thing to say. So Mark is a man who redeemed himself. Paul even makes sure that the Colossians receive him graciously, as they may be suspicious concerning what they may have heard about him. Right. So everything you heard about him that we've talked about previously, forget it. Welcome him warmly. All right. There's Jesus, who's named Justice. We don't really know anything about him.
So that's not the main Jesus.
No, not
That's
the
a
main
different
Jesus.
Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. Jesus was a name that like
That others use.
that other use. Yeah, it's Joshua. Yeshua. It's Joshua. Like Jesus's name is Joshua. That those two are the same names. It's just this is a Hellenism, like a Hellenic form of it. Um, because the name Joshua means savior. That's what the name Joshua means, right? So like this was a common name, but then when they were again making, and if you read it in Greek, it's they're the same.
So if we
But
were
when
reading
when
this line in Greek, how would they have spelled the word Jesus?
I'll get it up right here.
And how would they have spelled the word justice?
Oh, yeah, right. That's right. Because that would have been again like, Mark, Mark is John Mark, you know, but there's so many Johns, right? They were like, all right, this is Mark, you know.
Right.
So like these surnames are really important. This is Jesus Justice, right? Or Joshua Justice, right? So let's see here. What verse are we looking at? Jesus Justice?
11.
11. Thank you. Colossians 4:11. All right, here we go. I'll read it to you right now. I don't have my interlinear. I left it downstairs. All right, here we go. Yeah, here we go. Que, right? 11. And also, que Isus o legomenos justos, right? Isus is how we say Jesus, right?
We
That's
were
just
talking
it.
about the other
The,
Jesus.
the, the,
Don't
like
need
our Jesus, yeah.
our big Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this is we're talking about this being, a fairly common name, but when King James is having this English translation made for the first time, he's like, okay, hold on, wait, we can't just call Jesus the same name that's being used for Joshua and for this man, like we have to use a different name to differentiate. And so they're saying, okay, well, make it just write it in English how it looks in Greek. Don't right, like use the Greek pronunciation, like keep the Greek phonetic in. So instead of saying like, oh, well, this is Joshua. No, let's just say, okay, let's just say it's Jesus because it's Isus, right? Let's just because the yota became a J in all of their translations. Yeah. So there you are, right? So Jesus, whose name we don't know anything about him, but uh, one of the apostles. Okay, one of the 70 here. Okay, and then we talked about Luke. Then let's lastly talk about Demas. Demas, like Mark, had a falling out with Paul. He's downgraded from in here, right? So he was in Philemon, he's called a fellow laborer, right? One of my fellow laborers, just like how he's talking about here with Tychicus, my beloved brother, and Aristarchus, right? My fellow prisoner, right? So he's talking about all of these people with like, this is what I do. And now here it's just, and Demas, and Demas, all right? And in Second Timothy, chapter 4, verse 10, he becomes Demas, the one who has forsaken Paul for the cares of the world. So we watch Mark and Demas both be close to Paul and fall away from Paul, but we don't ever watch Demas come back while we see Mark come back, right? And so you've got these two examples of what it looks like to fall away from the church. And one is a tragic kind of like degradation over time, right? From Colossians, from Philemon to Colossians to Second Timothy, and then from Mark, you see from Acts, he's high and goes low in Acts, and then he comes back, which is really nice. All right, so verses 16 through 18 here. Well, let's just read the end, yeah. And then we'll talk a little bit about this Laodicean letter because that's mentioned here. Now in this epistle, excuse me, now when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea, and say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you have received from the Lord, that you may fulfill it. This salutation by my own hand, Paul, remember my chains. Grace be with you. Amen. Okay. Lest anyone cheat you. Okay, so this Laodicean letter, right? This Laodicean letter, like we talked about, um, is most likely the letter to Ephesians, right? Um, but it could also be the Gospel of St. Luke. It could be either thing, right? Because he makes the point here saying that this letter, which I've written by my own hand, Luke didn't write this one, I wrote this one, right? Um, because Luke might have been, uh, delivering, or preaching or working on his greater work, the big gospel. So it could be some people have used that by my own hand, to suggest that he is talking about the Gospel of Luke. But you can see here, even in our own Orthodox Study Bible, that the note here suggests that this is he means Ephesians here. Because again, they didn't name it, right? None of these books had names. They didn't have church chapters and verses. They didn't have numbers in them, right? They also didn't have names. He he wrote in a letter and he gave it to somebody to give to this church, right? And then he addressed the church. So when we read it, when the Greeks read it, they look at it and they're like, okay, to the faithful in Colossae, let's call this Colossians, you know? And so, you know, he may have thought that again, the letter to the Ephesians was really intended to be for the Laodiceans that are inland of Ephesus, but the first city that they would have arrived in was Ephesus. So, you know, who knows? So for Paul, he may have been thinking like, oh no, this is my letter to Laodicea, but the first people who are going to read it are going to be Ephesus, and they're going to walk all the way down the Lycus River to Laodicea.
So that Gospel of Saint Luke is Luke writing the letter of Ephesians for Paul.
No, the Gospel of Luke is the Gospel of Luke, right?
The
big Gospel of Luke, yeah. So, but Paul in his mind may view that as his gospel, right? Because he talks about like my gospel in other letters, you know. He didn't write a gospel.
There's no gospel
Luke did,
of
and he was dictating, right? And he was dictating unless we lost it, but I doubt that. I couldn't imagine that we would have lost the gospel of Paul, you know. That would have been that's crazy.
wait.
Like we have all these other apocryphal gospels that are still like maintained, you know, with historicity. You know, like we know that they're historical. We don't doubt that. Like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of, you know, of Bar, but we have them. They're just not in the Bible.
Where are
The originals, just you know, everywhere. Yeah, we have them. They're like you see them in like um ancient manuscripts that like still exist, and we have records of them.
they? Are they in Greece in a museum?
Let's see. I'll tell you.
So Father, we used to have a priest here, Father George Zervis, who since was a professor at the university, who literally went to somewhere. That's why I asked where.
It's
Because I
the
don't
Nag
remember.
the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt is where the complete Gospel of Thomas
Literally
is.
went in a room and
Read the real
observed
one?
some things.
Wow.
Sure.
That you can't really touch because they're
Too fragile.
mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. So
So the Gospel of Saint Luke was written by Luke, but it was what Paul saw. Right?
yeah.
So Paul was a witness to Jesus' life.
Well, he was a witness to a lot of the things that happened afterwards. Right. He was also given sight, right, by Christ. He saw that divine revelation on the road to Damascus, you know. So he had this relationship with Christ after the resurrection, you know, through prayer and through again like visible encounters with him.
Is that why he's accounted as an apostle?
Yes. Yeah.
I
And he
don't-
became and like they talked all the time. Like before he met Peter, right? Before he met the other disciples, they stayed there in Damascus for 3 years preaching. Like
who?
Paul,
Or he-
Paul, when Saul was converted by Ananias, the other Ananias, not the one that dropped dead, right? When he was converted by Ananias and baptized and received his sight, he and Barnabas together preached. So he learned all of this from Barnabas first, and then after 3 years, Barnabas is like, "You got to go meet Peter. You got to go meet James. You got to go meet all of them, right?" And so then they went. They went to Jerusalem. Barnabas gives him this huge introduction, right? Being like, this guy, I know that you heard a lot about him. I know that you saw him at the stoning of Stephen. He was there when Stephen was around. Like he saw all of this. He was a part of this. He just wasn't a follower. You know, he was in the temple when Christ is speaking. Of course he was. So he was just watching it as like an enemy, you know? It's like, again, watching a football game, rooting for the other team, but like, I can tell you everything that happened in the game on Sunday. I didn't like anything about it. I wasn't happy about it at the time. I can tell you everything that happened, you know? Right? So Paul is seeing all of it. Anytime that Christ came with his disciples to Jerusalem, he was there. He saw all of this. And we know that Jesus came to Jerusalem every year for Passover. We know that because it says in, the like Palm Sunday and all that, it says, and they went up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover, as was their custom, like as they did. So they did this all the time. It's just Palm Sunday is the like the last time, right? And that was when and really it was the last time because of the fanfare. Had they not received him like he was coming in as a king, they would have never executed him, you know? Yeah, the Jews got nervous about
And there
that,
was
and then the
no
Romans.
pencil and paper yet
No,
to
no.
write this all
Yeah.
down,
Right. Yeah. So
right?
like Paul is what anytime Christ is in Jerusalem, Paul is there watching it for sure. For sure. He might even be some of the Pharisees or Sadducees like that are questioning him. We don't know. Like Mark, Luke, but that none of them. And I imagine that if Luke were writing at the time he's writing this, Paul is Paul. He's not this enemy anymore. I'm sure he didn't want to like forever memorialize Paul's name here in like this bad way. Now, when he wrote Acts, he has to introduce Paul as a character, right? As a principal figure in the Acts of the Apostles. And so he said, okay, there's a man named Saul. He stood there at the stoning of Stephen, and people put their coats there. But he went to Damascus and then did all of these things, right? Like it was his entrance into like church history. So Luke had to write it there. But yeah, I imagine if Luke is writing all of these scenes, and if Paul happened to be one of those Sadducees or one of those, he wasn't a Sadducee, one of the Pharisees. If he had been one of those Pharisees that were there, like questioning Jesus, I'm sure Luke wouldn't have been like, and this one guy, like he wouldn't have done that, right? He wouldn't have like shamed him like that. That's probably also why we have so many of those accounts because Luke wasn't there he might have been because he was one of the 70. He was one of like the followers. He just wasn't one of the 12, right? So yeah, Mark was the same way. In fact, Mark, we're getting on a super tangent here, but in the Gospel of Mark, when it's the arrest narrative, like when Christ is being arrested in Gethsemane, and Peter takes out his sword and cuts Malchus's ear, right? The prison guard, his ear. The Gospel of Mark actually says that there was a young man who had a cloak and they grabbed it and like got his cloak off and ran away naked, right? And that Mark is the only one that talks about this interaction. That was most likely him. Mark was that young man. The biblical scholars are like, why did he include this detail? And Luke and Matthew don't. John obviously doesn't, because he's doing his own thing. They're like, why did Mark write this in? Well, because it was important to Mark because he was that guy. And we know that his parents were affluent. We knew that they lived in Jerusalem at the time. And so there are those who suggest that this young man was with them because their family hosted the disciples, that their family were the people that owned the upper room. And so that like Mark was like waiting the Passover meal, like he was serving them the Passover meal, and then was like listening to them have communion for the first time. Like, this is crazy. I'm gonna follow these guys now. And then like walked with them to the Garden of Gethsemane, and then saw that those things happen, and then like ran away. And that would also explain why he was young and maybe immature and like not ready to face martyrdom and persecution and all the things that they were going on. So we see these like insights into the authors through like what they choose to include in their texts. You know? So yeah, Luke and Paul were pairs, and Mark and Peter were pairs. From an authorship kind of side of things, because we always talk about like Paul and Silas, Paul and Barnabas, right? Yeah, yeah.
So Father, this Luke in verse 14, that's Luke, the gospel writer?
Yep. the
So he
evangelist.
was a medical doctor?
Yes, he was a physician.
Where did a person go to medical school in those times?
So
And to what extent were
um,
they able to develop skills?
Luke was highly educated. He was also among the apostles. He was the only one that was Greek. All of the other ones were Jewish, right? So Luke was a Greek, and that's why you see
He was born in Greece?
his tech. Well, was he born in Greece? I don't know where he was born, but that was his native language. He was educated, and that's why you see his gospel has like the most sophisticated language out of the three. Like John and Mark are very simple. Like the words are very simple. Matthew's a little bit more like well-rounded and like a little bit more refined. But it's you can tell that you're reading someone who has got a different vocabulary game than the others, right? So Luke was highly educated and educated in a variety of things. Most doctors were actually slaves, right?
What?
Were slaves, most doctors. It wasn't like an honorable profession. It was like if you've got to
You
work
better
with,
do this.
yeah, it was like out of necessity. And again, for the Jewish culture, like being in contact with blood or sickness made you defiled, right? Like you couldn't then go into the temple until you had done your Jewish rites of purification, right?
Oh.
And so, like, if there were a doctor in Judea, they were probably a slave or they were a Gentile. And certainly Luke was a Gentile. Like and that's why we know, like, they wouldn't have had Jewish, they wouldn't have had free Jewish doctors, right?
No.
They would either, that person would have been enslaved or would have been, somebody who didn't care about ritual bathing and like, I don't mind. Like, yeah, okay, that guy sneezed on me. I don't care. Like, that didn't scandalize me. Yeah.
Then.
So yeah, that's the evidence that we have that Luke was and just by the text. And his name was a Greek name. It's not a Jewish name. Lukas is a Greek name. So like it's clear that he was different.
And would doctors in those times, have had offices and hung up a
No, and that's what, yeah, no, they wouldn't have. They wouldn't have. It's not like what you think of today.
No,
Yeah.
and what skills could they possibly have had?
Oh, I mean, yeah, for sure. They just
And
they
there were
knew,
antibiotics.
they knew
and
medicinal things, like
seeds.
natural things. Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah.
Right, I'm assuming there's only male doctors, could they have been female patients?
Right. So then that's where you get like female like
Midwives and
handmaidens
things.
and midwives. Thank you. Why am I missing the word? Midwives. Yeah. That's where you get those kind of things. That's where in the early church, administratively speaking, we had deacons and deaconesses. We never had priests and priestesses, and we never had female bishops, but we had deaconesses because, like, if I were the bishop, right, and we're having the service, and then if people couldn't come, if they were sick, I'd send the men over there to go and visit the men who were sick. But like the women who were, whatever, I wouldn't send a male a male deacon there. I would have sent the women there because again, they still had this like this social. There was a social inequity, right? There like the inequality there, where like if you had sent me to that woman's house to go into her house while she's in her room, her bed, like that's not a place that I can go without legal kind of repercussions and scandal and all sorts of things. So they'd be like, no, no, here, you female deaconesses, go there and minister to them. But now, the church has grown in such a way that like we're no longer ministry is no longer just happening like privately or underground or in secret or in homes. It's now happening in churches, right? So now it's, oh gosh, we didn't need the kind of like the breakdown of like who can run where. And unfortunately, the role of the deacon just in general kind of is like, I don't know, underutilized in America, or just not, there just aren't that many deacons. We just don't have that many deacons now, you know? Because it's not a thing where we're running house to house to house to house to house, to like bring the gifts to people in their homes. Because we're not splintered. We have churches now, and now we have priests. So the priesthood has kind of like the presbyter priesthood has kind of like taken over the role of the deacon, because it used to be just bishops and deacons. But now we have too many churches, and we can't have a bishop in every city or a bishop in every town. So we have a bishop in like the regions, and now like Metropolitan Sebastianos is he is in charge of our church, but he's in charge of 73 other churches too. So he can't be at all of them together. So he leaves me here to be his representative here. But when he comes to visit, I move to the side and he's the priest. He's the celebrant, the primary celebrant, right?
That's kind of sad, brother. I've heard you say, oh, the bishop's coming. I'm sitting in the back by myself.
No, I'm just sitting to the I'm
Just to use this.
he's
for
at he's at the
example,
front of the altar. I go to the right side of the
Right,
altar.
and I don't know if you caught it when he said it, but if there are other priests here, they line up in seniorities.
Yeah, right.
Father
right.
Stephen might actually be at the back of the line
It could
in
be.
his own church.
Though I'll tell you. So
The bishop has come here maybe once since I've been around. And I remember you saying, well, the bishop's here, I'll be going in the back. And because my only other experience is the Catholic Church, where if the bishop is coming, all the priests in the parish, yes, the bishop would be in
Sure.
the center, but the other priests would be joyfully celebrating.
we are.
And everybody.
I'm not.
So
it's
would
not
you
a sad
be
thing.
in the
But
back
would you
the
be
whole
second
time.
as the
Yeah,
first
I would do the
here,
second.
you
I would
would
do
be
the second.
and then they go
Yeah,
to seniority.
yeah.
Okay,
I would do the second.
all right.
Yeah,
And while we're talking about the bishop, one day,
it's a joyful thing. You like want the bishop here. You feel full. You feel like, oh man, we're cooking.
Awesome to see them reverence him as well
Yeah, sure.
as their father, as
You-
their
you
not
see-
as a boss.
You see him. You see the full church represented.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like we're going to name him in name only with the petitions.
Right,
He exists, but he's not here.
right.
Like our mind is kind of like brought elsewhere for that moment, and then we come back. Now it's like he's here, right? We say, for our Archbishop, Sebastianos, that he, and for all the clergy and people, like, and then we like bow
Mhm.
because we see him,
Mhm.
and then he blesses us. So it's like this sweet thing
It is.
where like we don't just commemorate him and pray for him, we commemorate him and pray for him, and now he's here to bless us, like in response, like reciprocate that. It's really nice.
I remember one time I asked you what that fancy chair was for, and you said, oh, that's for when the bishop comes, that's the bishop's chair. Well, then the bishop came one
And
day.
well, and we
Let me
don't.
tell you the story. So the bishop came, and it was in the last year and a half or so. So I wondered, I thought, is he gonna go sit in that chair? Well, he went and he backed himself, his legs were maybe touching the chair, and he never sat in it.
Yeah, he never
It
sat.
doesn't
He,
sit.
he stands. Yeah.
So I thought, well, then what a waste of space and money to have that chair if no one's
Nope.
ever gonna sit.
So no. So that chair, and I was about to say this, as you were recollecting that memory, it's important that we have the throne there, even without the bishop here, because it reminds us that we again are part of this global body, this ecclesiastical body that's bigger than just Wilmington, right?
And
So
we don't
it's
know
huge,
it.
right? We never, yeah, right.
It's only for
Right.
the bishop.
It's just it's for Christ. It's for Christ. It's for Christ. It's for Christ. And so that was never, the bishop's throne was never the thing that was used ecclesiastically during the liturgy, right? That was always, the bishop's throne is an invention, a Byzantine invention during the height of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, because the emperor would come, because it was the state religion,
Right.
right? So the emperor would come to the liturgy, or the governor, or whoever it would be, and they would have the throne there, right? Well, they also wanted to make sure it was important to the state, the theocratic state, not democratic state, the theocratic state that it was, that church and state were equal. And that's why you have the Byzantine double-headed eagle, where you have two heads with one crown, right? So it was church and state together. One talon is holding the globe, and one talon is holding the staff, right? So it's, again, the global emperor and the shepherd, right, is this one double-headed eagle. Look at that right there, double-headed eagle with the single crown of Christ. It's one state underneath the one head of Christ. So there was a throne there for the emperor. Well, very quickly, we put a second throne out there for the bishop or the patriarch or whoever it was, depending on where you were in the world. And so you'd have the emperor and the bishop on two thrones. The bishop's spot during the liturgy should be the back of the altar, like facing the people at the vima, the vima, the judgment seat, right? And we do go to that place after the small entrance. After the small entrance, when there's a bishop, we all go and stand at the back of the altar, and then we come back to the front, right? But in the early church, the bishop would have never left. They would have been standing at the vima the whole time, and the deacons would have been at the front doing all of the things on the altar table underneath the supervising kind of approval of the celebrant, of the person that was observing all of it, right? Because his role is to be the role of Christ. Christ is the one at the judgment seat. He's not the one like doing the thing. But we do know that because he's the offerer and the one who is offered, right? So he's unique. And so that's why the bishop, like now today, the bishop moves back and forth. But we don't have the emperor coming anymore. So we got rid of one throne and then moved that throne back over to the other side. So we stop by the throne. We're there for, if we have a Vesper service, if we have an Orthros service, they're there the whole time. But during the liturgy, they're there for the doxology and then like up until the small entrance, and then they enter the altar to do the rest of the service. And at one point, they go to the back of the altar.
Forgive my ignorance to this matter, but is this the Archbishop of North Carolina or is this Archbishop?
It's the Metropolitan of Atlanta. Sebastianos, His Eminence Metropolitan Sebastianos is the Metropolitan of Atlanta, which is the whole southeast. It's
America is divided.
It's 7 metropolises, and the direct archdiocesan district of New York.
So
The Archbishop's in New York.
So he's all southeastern
Yeah.
Archbishop.
So it's North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Florida,
Georgia.
Tennessee, Georgia, yeah, and Louisiana. But the rest of New Orleans, New Orleans, but the rest of
Is there a higher patriarch of America or?
there is the Archbishop of America in New York, El Pitaforos. And then there's the Patriarch in Constantinople. Yeah. All right. Let's wrap up. We're still recording. Hold on. Linda, let's pause. Let's wrap up the recording, and then we can do some more Q&A. Thank you guys for being with us. We look forward to again continuing Bible study. We're going to do it again Wednesday next week, and then after that we'll be back to Thursdays because I'm done traveling after that. Okay. Through the prayers of Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. And end.